So China stabilized Germany and therefore stabilized Europe. And Washington is forcing Europe and Germany to de-risk, to de-globalize, to effectively to reduce its economic relations with China. And what do they expect? That there is no comparison between the difficulties that the Chinese economy is having to the fundamental systemic crisis of the European economy. In my view, China is experiencing the natural slowdown of an economy which for 30 years has been growing very fast. COVID was the reason why that slowdown took place now. China has had a mounting debt at the level of the prefectures, the local government for a while. Whenever debt increases, then at some point there is a slowdown until it's consolidated. Europe is nowhere near the level of systemic cohesion that China has. Europe is fragmented. Think about our monetary system. Our monetary system is designed to create problems. Like, when you drive your car, you may have an accident. Let's hope you don't. But your car is not designed to have an accident. It was not created to have an accident. Okay, an accident is something that can be avoided. If you're a bit more careful, you drive a bit more slowly, you respect the road rules, you will not have an accident. The European monetary system was designed to have an accident. Why am I saying that? We have a central bank that doesn't have a common treasury, Ministry of Finance, next to it. This is the only central bank in the world that doesn't have a common treasury to issue common debt on behalf of the whole of the Eurozone. So we have a central bank without a state behind it, because the European Central Bank is not allowed to help our member states. It's not allowed. So in Japan, since the 1990s, when the Japanese government is in debt or has a deficit, the Central Bank of Japan can finance the government. In the European Central Bank, that's not allowed. So that's point number one. Point number two, we have separate banking systems. So France has its own banking system, Italy has its own banking system. When the banking system of France is in trouble, the French government must bail it out, but it doesn't have a central bank from which it can actually seek help. Now, that's what I'm saying. It was like, again, to use the parable of a car, it was like removing the shock absorbers from your car, the shock absorbers which allow, if there's a bump, for the wheel to go up so that the car doesn't get extremely shaken. This is our own central banks and separate currencies, and then driving the car into a pothole. That's what we've done here. The result is this, that the German economy, which was always the driving force behind the European economy, which relied for years, for decades, on selling their net exports to Greece, to Italy, to Spain. They were a manufacturing miracle. They were producing a lot more cars and washing machines and refrigerators and chemicals that they wanted, that they could absorb, that they could buy, and they were selling them to us Greeks, to the French, to the Italians, and so on. And that was creating a surplus, which was coming back into Germany, which was then leaving Germany in the form of loans. Now, there was a recycling system. That broke down in 2008, completely. And now we have countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, that through austerity, they have been pushed to a lower level of economic activity, which means that our countries cannot absorb the exports of Germany. Now, this is a connection with China. Since 2009, China took over from the south of Europe, and your economy imported from Germany the cars and washing machines and chemicals and propellers and submarines and so on. So China stabilized Germany and therefore stabilized Europe. But at some point, two things happened. Firstly, the Chinese manufacturing sector advanced to a stage where you don't need to import stuff from Germany anymore. Now you've got Volkswagen that comes to China to recruit Chinese engineers because they don't have enough engineers in Germany. That's the first thing that has happened. The second thing that has happened is the new Cold War that was unleashed initially by Donald Trump against China and then turbocharged by Joe Biden. And Washington is forcing Europe and Germany to de-risk, to de-globalize, to effectively to reduce its economic relations with China. In other words, to sell less to China. Now they're going to introduce a stupid tax on electric cars, BYD and so on, coming from China to Germany. And what do they expect? That then the Chinese will buy more stuff from them? No, the opposite is going to happen. The whole model of the European economy, which is based on the division between surplus countries like Germany and deficit countries like Greece, that was shaken really badly in 2008. China stabilized that model. In addition to that, because of COVID-19 and the debt crisis, China and the United States have two advantages, major advantages, that Europe doesn't have. One is China and the United States developed a new form of capital, which I explained in my latest book, Techno-feudalism. I call it cloud capital. So, Tencent and Alibaba in China, Apple, Google, and Amazon in the United States, they've created a new form of capital where the value added comes from this interaction between the cloud and machines. Europe has not done that. We are still good at producing very nice bags, Hermes bags and Louis Vuitton and Ferrari cars and so on, but no cloud capital, which means that it is missing out on a new industrial revolution that the United States and China are pushing ahead, especially now with AI and so on. The second reason that the second huge problem that Europe has is low levels of investment in green technologies because of the crisis that I described before, and the fact that they've been bailing out their bankers with austerity for the many. That has depressed investment on everything, from cloud capital to green technologies. So now that we need to have access to green technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, and so on, there aren't enough in Europe. And they are introducing more tariffs on Chinese solar panels to satisfy the Americans. So we are falling and falling and falling. In other words, do not make the mistake of comparing and contrasting the Chinese economic slowdown with what's happening in Europe. Europe has lost, it's like, being at the train station to discover that the train has left the station. Europe is in perfect decline. I do not see how this is going to be reversed. It's getting worse. We used to have a divide between the North and the South. Now have a divide between the East and the West because of the war in Ukraine. With the rise of fascism, we have not made any moves towards consolidating, towards having a federal government that can plan ahead for Europe. Marx was a very smart person. He never predicted anything, right? I mean, if you read carefully Marx, and I have read Marx very carefully, what he says is completely correct, that capitalism is a necessary condition for socialism. But he didn't say that socialism is inevitable, that if you have capitalism, then you're going to have socialism. No. In order to have socialism, you have to have capitalism. That's what Marx says. And I agree with him. Rosa Luxemburg, the great communist revolutionary and a great idol of mine, put it very bravely when she was in a prison cell, she put a question to us: socialism or barbarism? After capitalism, you may get socialism or you may get barbarism. And what I'm saying in my book is that we're getting a very technologically advanced form of barbarism, because the left has failed here in Europe. We are the great losers. So organized labor, which was supposed to create the circumstances for the proletariat to take over the means of production, the machinery, capital. Well, either our trade unions have been destroyed or have been co-opted by capital and the bankers. So organized labor did not manage to rise up against capital and take over capital. And you've had, one of the reasons was the Soviet Union experiment, which was a disaster to the extent that the working class of the Soviet Union did not rise up to support communism. They applauded the fall of communism and they embraced a kind of gangster capitalism that we now see in Russia. And therefore, you had the complete triumph of capital after 1991 with globalization and all this. In the process, because Marx was absolutely right to say that capitalism is not sustainable. Capitalism creates its own enemy within itself in the form of organized labor, in the form of economic crisis of 1929, of 2008. It wasn't the left that created 2008. It was the bankers in Wall Street. They're like stupid viruses that kill the organism that they infect. That was Marx's point about capitalism, right? So one of the things that happened was, well, the main thing that happened, and this is what I say in my book, Techno-feudalism, is that capital triumphed so much It was so successful that it mutated into a more toxic version of itself, which I call cloud capital. And cloud capital overthrew capitalism. And what do I mean by overthrew capital? We didn't create, a new system of government. No. But without us even realizing, it ended the two main forces of capitalism. What are the two main forces of capitalism? According to Marx, one is profit. Under feudalism, it was rent. The feudal lord, the baron, extracted value from the peasant by force. That's rent. That's not profit. You produce 100 kilograms of rice, and I come and take 60 away from you, right? That's not a market process. This is an extractive process, a brutish, forceful extraction of rent from you. I take it because I am the lord. I have property rights over the land on which you grow the rice. But capitalism replaced this extractive process by a market process. Instead of being a peasant, you become a proletarian. You get paid a wage which is lower than the value of the rice you produce. Your labor is a commodity like rice, so it looks as if it is completely voluntary and free. It's a market system. But in the end, you get exploited because of surplus value. But think of what cloud capital does, whether it's Alibaba or Amazon or Baidu or Tencent, WeChat, whatever. You have machinery which is no longer created to produce things. So if a steam engine or industrial robot is a produced means of production. It's a machine that you produce in order to produce other things, other stuff. But cloud capital is a produced means of changing our behavior, not of producing stuff. So, big tech is in the business of changing our behavior in a way which can then turn into a new form of rent for the owners of this cloud capital, of this produced means of our behavioral modification. So the moment you get into Amazon.com, you exit the market because Amazon.com belongs to one man, Jeff Bezos, right? It's not a market. It's a trading place. But a trading place is not the same thing as a market. Because in a marketplace, when you go to a village and there's a market, lots of farmers, they sell their vegetables, right? They're all independent of each other. You and your friend walk around, you look at the different lettuces and tomatoes and, fruit, and you say, oh, this looks nice. You have a discussion. You can't do this in Amazon.com because the algorithm doesn't allow you to talk to anyone unless it is in the interest of the algorithm, the owner of the algorithm, that you talk to somebody so as to maximize that somebody's capacity to extract money from you. And the platform keeps 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. That's a rent. We are going back to the feudal rent, only it's techno-feudal. That's my story. So you have this replacement of markets with digital fiefdoms, and you have the replacement of profits by cloud rent. Of course, the whole system still needs a capitalist sector where value is produced. Somebody has to produce the stuff that you buy on the digital platform. But the producers of that stuff, both the workers and the capitalists, are vassals of the owners of the cloud fief. I call them cloudalists, the techno-feudal lords. And this is destabilizing from a macro perspective as well. Because when so much money is taken in the form of rent, cloud rent, it doesn't return to the economy. Because you see, if you have a bicycle producer back in the old days, right? This bicycle producer has a profit. Then a large part of that profit will go back into machinery for making bicycles, for improving the bicycles. So the money will be returned to the circular flow of income and investment. But Jeff Bezos has $250 billion in the bank. If he gets another $50 billion, where is he going to invest it? He's not going to invest it. Maybe he will buy another island in Hawaii, but that's not investment. Okay? So the money is lost from this circular flow of income. That's the story of my book. And also, and I think that is pertinent for people in China, I try to explain in my book the new Cold War between the United States and China. Because, it's just astonishing, isn't it? Up until a few years ago, I used to lecture in the United States, teach there, talk to people. They always said to me, when they wanted to defend globalization, they would say wonderful things about China. See, China has been inducted into the global economy. Globalization works. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty. Look at China. China. And suddenly, China is the threat and must be contained. And I was asking myself, and them, why? And they would say stupid things like Taiwan. I said, what about Taiwan? Oh, they want Taiwan. They consider it to be their own. I said, yeah, they always consider it to be their own. That's not new. Why were you struggling in the 1990s to induct China in the World Trade Organization? What did they think then? That Taiwan should be independent? Then they say things to me, but they are spying on us. I said, what do you mean? You are spying on everyone. I mean, the NSA is spying on me, on you, and everyone. They are spying on the American president. The only explanation in the last chapter, I tell my story as to what I think is the real cause of the new Cold War that Trump and then Biden unleashed against China. And it's got to do with the fact that China is the only economic bloc that has developed cloud capital in competition with America's cloud capital. India hasn't, South Africa hasn't, Europe certainly hasn't. And the problem with Chinese cloud capital, from the perspective of the United States, is that in China, you've got something that they don't have. You have WeChat, which allows you to make payments without going through banks and without paying huge fees to the bankers. Now, that's not a technological thing. The Americans could have had it too. But the Wall Street bankers do not allow big tech, Silicon Valley, to break down, to enter the monopoly of the bankers. So there is no equivalent of WeChat. And there is no equivalent of the Chinese central bank's digital currency. Now, the Fed could have had a digital dollar, but the bankers in Wall Street would not let them, because the bankers in Wall Street want people to have a bank account with them, not with the Fed, not with Google, not with Apple. So this clash between big tech, cloud capital, American cloud capital, and Wall Street, which doesn't exist in China, the two work together, they've been fused. Financial capital and cloud capital in China is one thing, is giving a major advantage to Chinese cloud capital. Let's face it, why is America dominant? They are only dominant because they monopolize the international digital payment systems. They see the alternative Chinese digital payment system using cloud capital as a major threat. Because if they lose that monopoly of the dollar payment system, then America is gone. America is a country that is constantly in deficit. How are they succeeding since 1970? They've been in deficit since 1968. And yet they are the only superpower in the history of the world who are getting stronger while being in deficit, because everybody else is paying in their currency. So if they lose this monopoly of the dollarized payment system, okay, then they're gone. And the Chinese cloud capital, big finance agglomeration alliance is a clear and present threat for American hegemony. That is my explanation. If you don't understand the concept of cloud capital and the difference between American and Chinese cloud capital, you do not understand why we may be heading for a third world war between the United States and China. And I think they did very well, because otherwise you rely on American cloud capital. So, for instance, ever since the massacre in Gaza has begun, I have spent most of my day campaigning in favor of peace in the Middle East, against apartheid, and so on and so forth. Now, I have to use American cloud capital. I have to use X, or formerly Twitter. I have to use YouTube. And I'm constantly in fear that somebody in Silicon Valley will switch me off. Already we've been switched off a number of times. To have access to cloud capital that is not controlled by the hegemon is essential. And I have no doubt that the Chinese authorities thought of that. The European authorities never thought of that.